Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. For many of us who love reading Hemingway, there's another way to connect with the author, with the glamour and ruggedness of his life, and my guests today are making it possible to do that. You see, Hemingway lived in Cuba for many years. His house was called Finca Vigia. Artifacts in his house are still intact. His papers, instructions to the gardener, his drinking glasses, his phonograph, it's all there.
We're at Finca Vigia in Havana, Cuba. This is the pathway to the swimming pool at Finca Vigia. You can see it remains lush. Here's what Hemingway calls a doorbell. He rang this bell when he received important guests, when he received happy people, when he was in good spirits to welcome them to his home.
The Finca Vigia Foundation is working to restore the house and preserve Hemingway's legacy. Mary Jo Adams is the executive director of the foundation. Mary Jo, thank you for joining us on American Voices.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here, Senator.
And Dr. Sandra Spanier is on the foundation's board. She's a professor of literature at Penn State and general editor of the Hemingway Letters Project, published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Spanier, welcome to American Voices.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to know how each of you came to this project. Let's start with Dr. Spanier. When did you first become interested in Ernest Hemingway?
Well, I can trace my interest in Hemingway back to a trip to Key West when I was an undergraduate English major and visited his house. I'm from Iowa. Hemingway was from Oak Park, Illinois, and I was in Key West in July, and it was incredibly exotic. It felt like a very distant outpost, and I think as a Midwesterner, I understand the lure of faraway, exotic places that I think drew Hemingway to various places around the world. So that was my first spark of interest. After that trip, I came back home and started reading everything that he'd written. And then that developed into an academic interest later on, to the point now that I'm in charge of a project to gather and publish all of his surviving letters that we can locate.
So Mary Jo, how did you get interested in it? What was your background before working with the foundation?
It's funny, I'm a psychologist by training. However, I grew up in a teeny tiny town on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and I was an avid reader, and I pretty much spent most of my time in the public library. And I loved the books, especially in junior high school, that allowed me to travel. And I remember reading Hemingway. I remember the first thing I really remember was The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Now, I was way too little, but I liked the word Kilimanjaro.
Don't we all like that word?
I didn't have a clue what I was reading. I didn't know what gangrene was. I didn't know about these relationships, these complicated relationships with the couple. But I remember thinking, wow, Africa has mountains with snow, where I was used to watching Tarzan movies. And that kind of made me think of a different way about Africa. And then later I picked up a book, I'm still young, about bullfighting. And I remember asking my parents, why would anyone ever do that to a bull? It just seemed like a crazy idea. Yet what attracted me, even as I was a young girl, was his colorful lifestyle. I kind of found it attractive. And as somebody who grew up a little bit lonely by myself on the seashore or by the marsh, I wanted a colorful life, and I liked that. But later in college, in literature classes, rereading Hemingway, I really wondered why my parents did not censor the majority of the material that I read. But I credit Hemingway, and among others that I found at our public library, as piquing really a lifelong interest in traveling. And I find it so ironic that now I have such good fortune to travel to Cuba for the last 20 years, as many times as I need to help preserve Hemingway's shared American and Cuban cultural legacy. Mm-hmm. It's a full cycle.
So Dr. Spanier, can you tell us about the history of Finca Vigia? I mean, yes. I understand Martha Geldhorn, his third wife, found the house. what was going on in his life at the time and that he needed or wanted a home in Cuba.
Well, Hemingway met Martha Gellhorn, who was an intrepid young writer, when she walked into Sloppy Joe's bar with her mother and brother in December of 1936. And he was immediately taken with her, and she ended up staying on in Key West a little longer than her mother and brother, and they talked a lot about writing. She had just been on the cover of the Saturday Review of Literature. She was an up-and-coming young writer. In the spring of 1937, they both ended up in Spain. He was there to cover the Spanish Civil War, and she got herself some press credentials with Collier's Magazine to do the same. Their romance blossomed, and so they had a very intense affair throughout the Spanish Civil War. In the meantime, Hemingway is married to his second wife, Pauline, and she and their two children, Patrick and Gregory, are living in the house in Key West. After the cause was lost and Franco and his forces won the Spanish Civil War, and Hemingway, because of his personal situation and his relationship with Martha, was not going to go back to Key West and the family home. He then went to Cuba, where he'd been visiting and fishing since the early 1930s. Martha Gellhorn was also there. They sort of moved in together, living in a hotel room. She needed a place that had more peace and quiet. So she found this rundown villa through a classified ad and talked him into renting it. And he was reluctant at first. It's about 10 miles outside of Havana in a small town, San Francisco de Paula. They moved there together. She fixed up the house. And when he sold his 1940 novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, to the movies, he got a very large sum for that sale. And he used part of it to actually buy Finca Vigia. So it was Martha Gellhorn who found it, but he fell in love with it. And that was his home for the rest of his life. He lived in Cuba and at Finca Vigia longer than he lived anywhere else in his life. And he loved it.
So, as a student of Hemingway and his writing, could you tell us the theory of omission that he believed in and why, in your view, that he was such an important American writer?
He had this theory that if a writer knows what he wants to say and feels it truly enough, then he could omit that in the writing. And the reader, who, if the reader is being attentive enough, will feel all of the emotions as strongly as if the writer had stated them. He talked about cutting away the scroll work, all the descriptive adjectives and adverbs, and just writing in very straightforward, simple language. He said in his 1932 book, Death in the Afternoon, that the dignity of movement of an iceberg is the fact that 7/8 of it is below the surface. And when you look at his manuscripts, you see that when he revises, he's not adding to his draft, he's cutting, he's stripping details away and leaving the bare bones.
Do you think that was a correct analysis of the English language?
I think that it's certainly a very powerful approach. He said that he was trying to write the way that Cézanne painted, so that rather than filling in every little detail and trying to make a photographic, realistic picture, he wanted to do what the Impressionist painters were doing and describe things in broad brushstrokes, leaving some spaces there for the reader to fill in.
So, Mary Jo, let me ask you, what is your experience of Finca Vigia and being there? I love it, the fact that it's on a hill and overlooks the harbor, right?
No, it's beautiful. Finca Vigia is a very beautiful yet simple home. It's 7 rooms, 1 story. Whenever I use the word bungalow, someone complains, but that's what it reminds me of, a little bungalow, not a villa. And it has huge windows and French doors. The air quality is clear. It's up on a hill. It has views of Havana Harbor and the city of Havana in the distance. The property is just lush with mangoes and almonds, avocado trees. He liked his gardens wild, and he would often at least the executive director there, told me that he would reprimand the gardeners if they made it too fancy or too nice. The furniture is where it has always been. Sometimes the dining room table has crystal on it with a Hemingway's stamp on the back of it. He has a mixture of elegant sort of Italian crystal juxtaposed to animal trophy heads looking down at you as you eat dinner. Every room has a bookcase in it. There are more books than my small public library that I was just talking about. There are books everywhere. And the reason that the conservation work that we do, that we're able to do it, is he crammed the books in together so tightly that pests or sunlight or bookworms could not make their way into the pages.
That's amazing.
The collection is quite remarkable. His phonograph still works. In his private bathroom, he has written on the wall his blood pressure and his weight, off and on for the last maybe 5 years of his life. And I think he was always concerned about his health. And our foundation uncovered these with the help of due to the experience of a very talented Cuban muralist who was able to remove about 3 layers of paint to actually find the pencil markings underneath. So the house is truly as Hemingway left it. His clothes are in the closet. We've had a textile expert repair some of his neckties, which he didn't own a lot of, but he did have some. His boots, his shoes, his military uniform, a matador's cape that was given to him after a bullfight.
So, Dr. Spanier, what did you find especially interesting?
It was known that there were some letters there. In 1995, a curator, someone from the Kennedy Library in Boston was also on the trip. And he wasn't really able to see much, but because of that, I knew that there were papers there. And he came back and declared it an archival emergency that these papers needed to be preserved because of the effects of humidity and just the tropical climate, mold, bugs. I mean, heat and humidity is not kind to paper. Thanks to the efforts of over a very long time of the Finca Vigia Foundation, those papers have been conserved, preserved. Copies have been made of them. They've been scanned, and now they are accessible to scholars internationally through the Kennedy Library in Boston, which has the world's largest collection of Hemingway's papers.
What are in those papers?
There are rejected drafts. There's a rejected epilogue to his 1940 novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. There are letters, thousands of pages of letters, both letters that he sent and also letters that he received.
So is there anything you learned about him from the letters that surprised you?
His sense of humor, his tenderness and affection toward Martha Gellhorn, for example, who, in the image of their marriage is that you had these two titans clashing at all times, but he was tender and loving and so proud of her and her work. That is not something that comes through in what either of them had to say about the other after their marriage dissolved, and most of the biographies don't capture that aspect of their relationship. So loving letters to and from his sons, congratulatory telegrams from other famous figures after he got the Nobel Prize. There's a scrapbook.
We were all surprised to see that he was a scrapbook maker. You wouldn't necessarily think of Ernest Hemingway as someone who made scrapbooks, but there were 5 of them at the Finca. But from a conservator's perspective, they were a nightmare. They're very important documents, and I know the Kennedy Library was thrilled to get the images of them. But imagine, some of them have Scotch tape, some of them are stapled. Different types of papers, different types of inks. Some of the pages stuck together because of pollen. And so these scrapbooks took 7 years from start to end to conserve.
So, Mary Jo, you're the executive director of the foundation. What kind of challenges do you encounter pulling all this together, and how do you solve the problems?
I think in the beginning, the challenge was trust, respect, kindness. We were Americans. We were from the powerful country to the north. Were we going to do what we said? Were we going to steal things? Were we going to pretend that this was our work? And the first challenge, I believe, was just establishing trust that we will do what we say. We are always two teams working as one. This was a collaboration between two nations that aren't used to collaborating. And I think that was the hardest challenge, more than anything physical or how to get a visa or how to bring tile to Cuba. It was, how do you get the respect of people who don't trust you and had no reason to? And that was the biggest hurdle. And, we had some reservations ourselves. So we've never worked together, these two nations, pretty much. So how do we do it? And we did it. We did it with clarity. We signed a series of what they called accords. We might call them memorandums of understanding in terms of what we hope to achieve in the next 2 years, who would do it, when would it be done. We established goodwill, both of us. We did things with respect and honesty. We were all people of good intentions. We chose our team very carefully, and we did it with patience. And I'm pretty happy to say that we're well over that hurdle and onto the work on many levels.
So what happens when you work together as a team? That wouldn't have happened otherwise. Cubans and Americans at Finca Vigia.
When we would hit a dead end, we just go, oh, darn it. All right, let's back up. Where did we go awry? And everyone put their heads together, and it was a hard process, and it was also a joyous process. And when the building was completed, there was a inaugural ceremony with some people from the United States and from Cuba, and was broadcast live on Cuban national TV. And it was a celebration for all. So the challenges of being trusted, which is a big one. And I'm always I've never been to Cuba once, and I've probably been there 100 times, where someone doesn't say, where are you from? And you say the United States, and they say, well, gee, you don't seem like an American. So we are Americans. And I said, well, where'd you get your information? And it's generally, television, Hollywood, or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, but that's what happens when you have no contact.
No, the people-to-people exchange of the project is truly the gem on the crown.
So, Mary Jo, I hear one of your interests has a real Hemingway feel to it. I understand you're an avid fisherwoman.
That's
you have
right.
a boat, and I understand last week you caught a giant tuna. What was that like, being out there by yourself on the water? And how did you get started fishing, and how was it to land that tuna?
Well, I got started fishing from my dad back in the days when I would spend my time in the library or fishing. But I happened to catch the tuna off the coast of Florida, actually, in the Florida Straits. And I had a captain who helped me reel it in because it was really very big. My family lived on sushi forever. I don't think we can eat it again for a while. But here in Boston, I have lobster pots. And if I don't catch anything, I'm perfectly happy because I bring a book, I'll throw the anchor, I'll, pull up the pots. And Hemingway was a far better fisherman than me, I'll tell you.
Huh. So you caught the tuna, but you're really also going after lobsters, right?
I do. Here in the northern cool waters, striped bass, lobster, flounder.
So why do you like fishing?
I find it peaceful. I love being on the water. I don't mind if I don't catch anything. And most of the fish I catch, I throw back anyway. But it's very peaceful. My husband likes to say that we sort of feed the fish in Boston Harbor because the lobsters go in our pots, they eat. Because I'm not a commercial fisherman, they have to be humane traps. So they back out after they've had a nice dinner and they're gone. They're nocturnal. So by the time I pull the traps, they're empty. There's no lobster, nor is there any bait. So I think I'm feeding them.
That sounds like that's what you're doing. Listen, I want to thank you both for being here on American Voices and for all you do to preserve the legacy of a great American writer.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.
I've been speaking to Mary Jo Adams, Executive Director of Finca Vigia Foundation, and Dr. Sandra Spanier, a board member at the foundation and professor of literature at Penn State. She's the general editor of the Hemingway Letters Project, published by Cambridge University Press. To find out more, visit us on Facebook. It's American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.